Well, that was Indonesia's President Joko Widodo right there with a rather a grim, not outlook, but maybe a grim understanding of the current economic condition right now. Although Indonesia's economy did perform well in 2022, what about next year? Well, to get a better sense of it all and understanding of the health of Indonesia's economy, we are joined by the director of the Center of Economic and Law Studies, or Celios, Bhima Yudhistira. Good afternoon, Bhima. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so as we heard just now from President Widodo, he is urging caution, saying that economic conditions are not easy, very difficult to predict, many uncertainties. What do you make of President Widodo's messaging? It sounds like he's saying that Indonesia could face a rather tough time next year. What do you think?
Yeah, next year will be like a lot of challenge coming from monetary, like a higher inflation rate, and also volatility of the rupiah currency against US dollars. And many of the commodity exports that we gain as a bonanza this year perhaps will be like short terms in the 2023. So we see that the CPO price already slowing down a little bit, and also the coal price because of the recessions in the Europe, perhaps in the US, and also the zero COVID policy opening in China, the transition from the very close restriction mobility to opening little bit, I think it will be like not much smooth landing. So it also impacting Indonesian export, Indonesian investment next year. And from the fiscal side, we see that the state budget as part of the counter-cyclical measures, we gain a lot of the tax revenue to more than 100% this year. But unfortunately, there is still some challenge that how the tax revenue, the tax ratio, and also some of the government expenditure can boost the economy and also the demand in the domestic markets. That will be like a huge question.
Right, so global slowdowns, especially in those massive export markets for Indonesia, including China, could impact Indonesia's exports and thus economy. But that's what you're saying. But amid all these challenges, still the government of Indonesia is predicting 5.3% growth next year. What is Celios's growth projection for 2023 and why?
For next year's, we project around 5% below 5%. So in the actual number, 4.3 up to 4.8%. So I think below the government projection of the GDP growth because of the some factors, including also the interest rate increase by the central bank, will be impacting the credit growth and also impacting the consumers' confidence next year. Although some of the banks still hold their interest rate increase very sharply, but I think there will be like 3 to 5 months about the migration from the central bank tightening policy to the credit policy from each of the commercial bank. And also we see that the inflations from the energy price, which is the fuel price hikes this year, still impacting to the inflations overall in next year's. And the food price, I think the government should concern more about the food price. Let's see what's happening because the government imported a lot of the rice recently to prevent the inflation soar. I think the inflation will be like a game changer. If the government can hold the inflation, perhaps we can grow at least 4.8% next year. But if the government failed to maintain or tame the inflations, both energy and volatile food inflation, I think the story will be much different because the domestic market in Indonesia is so huge that I think there will be like a huge contribution also to the overall economy because we cannot rely too much on the export or from the foreign investment next year.
Right. Now, before going on to consumer demand and domestic demand, your range of forecast is from 4.3 to 4.8%. Now, that's much lower even than the World Bank, which is projecting 4.7. So in the lower range, in the 4.3%, what is the worst case scenario that Indonesia's economy could grow by 4.3%?
Yeah, we see from the study from Oxford Economics and also from the World Bank itself that there will be like a huge decrease if the global recession scenario occurred next year. So the developed economies perhaps only growth negative 0.6%, while the developing market countries only growth at least around um, 1.8%. So if that the benchmark that the Indonesian economy growing more than 4% is already enough, because many of the countries that major trade partner, major investment partner cannot grow more than 1.8%. So we cut the average 1.8, and when the Indonesian economy can grow beyond even 4%, I think that's not too. At least some of the macro indicators like rupiah currency and also reserve, capital reserves, I think everything is under control. I think will be a little bit slowed down, but still the economy little bit solid compared with the other G20 or even emerging countries in general.
Right. Even 4% growth is still 4% growth. That's still positive growth for next year. Now, I want to talk to you about consumer demand. That was one of the main factors behind Indonesia's substantial economic growth this year, contributing over 50% to GDP in every quarter so far. So how do you see consumer demand next year, and how will it contribute to growth in 2020 for Indonesia, 2023 for Indonesia?
I think we see some recent update from the mobility, especially for the urban population, that they begin to having a retail transactions, having go to the financial market as well. And also they buying stuff that previously during the restriction of the mobility, perhaps they have a limited spending, and many of the fund they receive set in the bank. But right now, everything going to change toward the positive attitude toward the consumers spending more because of the COVID policy also a little bit relaxed. I think that's a good sign, but we see that not all of the consumers, they have plenty of the cash. Many of the 40% below the poverty line, for instance, they rely much for the government social assistance to spending more 2023. So therefore, the government budget also can help those that perhaps still struggle with the inflation, still struggle with the layoff issues, to maintain their purchasing powers, so the consumptions of the domestic market still solid next year.
Right, Bhima. The major concern, of course, right now is that many institutions are forecasting a possible recession, or at least a significant global slowdown next year. But on Thursday, data came in showing that the U.S. economy grew by 3.2% in the third quarter. It also grew over 2% in the previous quarter. Do you still forecast a recession to happen in the U.S. and maybe globally next year?
I think there's still a chance or probability, even though the probability right now little bit decreased compared with the first semesters 2022. Why is that? Because the U.S. perhaps the economic growth is still positive, because I think some of the productions of the manufacturing sector, food and beverage, they increase the productivity coming for the Christmas or New Year's Eve. But if we look deeper, the inflation year on year is still high with the historical inflations in the US, and also the impact of the tightening monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. I think it will impacting a lot of the consumer spendings and also industrial output, not this year's, but in the following years. I think there will be a chance of the US still in the recessions mode. And also in the Europe, we see that the energy crisis, I think it's very serious issue, because the war in Ukraine not yet, let's say not yet, a little bit decrease the risks of the geopolitical tensions. So there will be like a still energy crisis, food security crisis in Europe that can trigger recessions, at least in the first semester